In the kingdom of Zarian, far beyond the reaches of human space, the stars themselves seemed to bow before the grandeur of its capital. The sky was a perfect gradient of purple and gold. The very air was thick with the hum of advanced technology and alien life, unlike anything humanity had encountered. Every being, from the highest Zarian noble to the humblest servant, had been born under the blessing of their perfect civilization. Their beauty, their intelligence, their capabilities were the epitome of evolution, each of them a living testament to the triumph of their race. Princess Lyra was the crown jewel of this kingdom, the very embodiment of its excellence. She was born with the gift of unparalleled intellect. Her beauty was whispered to be so breathtaking that even the stars seemed dim in comparison. Yet what set her apart from the rest of her people was her unyielding disdain for their customs and the suits of marriage they presented to her. At every turn, her father, King Thalix, had been trying for years to find the one who would win her heart. But none could measure up, no one was worthy in her eyes. They would come from the farthest corners of the galaxy, elegant princes, warlords, and ambassadors. They would arrive with promises of peace and power, each thinking their wealth or prowess could win her favor. But every single one failed. They faltered under the pressure of her gaze, unable to match her sharp wit or her strength of mind. Their attempts were as transparent to her as a glass mirror. She saw through their flattery and their pretensions, each suitor a fleeting shadow in the face of her true desires. She did not seek grandeur or riches, nor did she want a ruler beside her to sit on a throne. She longed for something different, something that transcended the games of power that dominated her world. In the quiet moments, she would wander the palace halls, lost in thought, gazing out into the deep void beyond the stars, wondering what lay outside her perfect prison. There were whispers that Lyra's mind was too vast for even her own people to understand, that she would never marry because no one could ever match her intellect or vision. In truth, the pressure was growing unbearable. With every failed suitor came the increasing expectations from her father, who was desperate to find a solution. His advisors counseled him to extend the offer of marriage to a greater variety of species. He was told that connection with humanity might be the answer. After all, the humans had begun to make their mark in the galaxy with their unyielding determination and their surprising resilience. They had managed to thrive in the most hostile environments with nothing but grit and ingenuity. They were seen as an underdeveloped species, but there was something undeniable in their rise against the odds. Lyra had heard of them, their wars, their conflicts, their triumphs and failures, but she had always dismissed them as insignificant. She didn't believe that a race so primitive could offer anything of value, especially not in the way her kingdom had been shaped. She could not fathom how a species with so many flaws could possibly offer her something her own people could not. Yet here her father stood convinced that inviting human delegates to the Grand Royal Gala would provide the answer he had so desperately searched for. He would offer them the chance to present themselves and see if their strange ways could meet the standards of the princess. At the very least, it would be a diversion for her, but she would never let it be more than that. The Grand Royal Gala was to be a spectacle unlike any other in Zarian history. The palace halls were lined with shimmering crystals and glowing banners depicting the rich history of the kingdom. Delegates from every corner of the galaxy were invited to witness the event and present their finest offerings. The air buzzed with excitement as musicians played soft melodies and dancers twirled in elaborate costumes beneath the soft golden lights. Lyra's father, King Thalix, stood proudly at the center of it all, greeting guests with the air of a monarch who believed this event would solve all of his kingdom's problems. But for Lyra, the grand banquet was nothing more than a well-practiced performance. She slipped through the crowds unnoticed, making her way to a quieter balcony where she could observe the proceedings from afar. She had little interest in the ceremony or the carefully orchestrated displays of wealth that accompanied every suitor's entrance. She already knew they would fail to impress her. She had seen it all before, and the thought of yet another pompous prince or smug ambassador made her stomach churn. What caught her attention instead was something entirely unexpected: a lone human standing near the edge of the gala, watching with a quiet intensity, while others flaunted their finest garments and expensive trinkets. This human stood out not because of his appearance, but because of his demeanor. He was not dressed in the fine robes or polished armor that many of the other delegates wore. He had none of the overblown displays of wealth or status. Instead, he wore simple clothes, a faded jacket, and well-worn boots that suggested a life spent in struggle rather than luxury. His face was scared, but his eyes held a strange spark, something raw and unrefined yet unyielding. There was no arrogance in his stance, no attempt to draw attention, yet Lyra felt her gaze pull toward him, as though something deep inside her recognized him in a way she couldn't explain. The human did not speak. He simply observed the guests as they milled about with their well-rehearsed smiles and false pleasantries, as if he were analyzing them. His focus was unwavering, and Lyra found herself wondering what he saw in them, what he would think of her. She watched him for a long time before he finally noticed her presence. His eyes met hers across the vast ballroom, and for a moment there was no pretense, no walls between them, just an unspoken understanding. Lyra blinked in surprise and quickly turned her attention away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something strange, something that no alien prince or wealthy ambassador could have offered. Her curiosity tugged at her as she returned to her father's side, pretending to listen to the conversations around her. But her mind kept drifting back to the human delegate who had not tried to impress her or anyone else. His quiet presence was unlike anything she had encountered before, and it unsettled her in a way that she could not ignore. When the banquet continued on, she found herself seeking him out again, as if drawn by an invisible thread. She needed to know who he was, and why his silence had spoken louder than all the others. The next day, Lyra sought him out without fully understanding why she was drawn to the human delegate who had captured her attention the previous evening. The grand halls of the palace were empty now, save for the faint hum of advanced machinery and the soft footsteps of servants going about their duties. It was early morning, and the sun barely filtered through the palace windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Lyra found him standing by a balcony, just like the one she had observed him from before. He was alone, staring out at the sprawling city beneath the palace walls. The distant hum of alien ships echoed in the distance, but the human seemed oblivious to it all, lost in the quiet of the moment. He did not turn when she approached. He simply stood there with his back to her. But something about his stillness struck her. He had a presence that was undeniable, despite the lack of any outward show of power or status. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. What could she say to someone so different, so out of place, yet so intriguing? In the end, it was the simplest thing she could think of. She spoke his name. The words felt strange on her tongue, but they carried weight with them. She saw his posture stiffen just slightly, but he did not turn. Instead, he continued to look out over the city, as if considering how to answer her greeting. His voice, when it finally came, was calm and measured, but carried a certain rawness that matched the look in his eyes. "I wasn't expecting to see you today, Princess," he said, his gaze still focused on the horizon. Lyra blinked at the unexpected directness in his tone. There was no formality, no bow, no flattery, just simple acknowledgement. She had grown accustomed to hearing her title spoken with reverence or fear, yet here was a human treating her words like any other. His honesty was disarming. And before she could think of a response, he added, "You seem troubled." Lyra found herself taken aback. His observation was not some empty pleasantry. It was a statement that struck at something deep inside her. She had spent so many years perfecting the art of keeping her thoughts hidden, and yet here was someone who had seen through her facade. Without even trying, she wanted to dismiss his words, to tell him it was none of his business. But something stopped her. Instead, she found herself speaking the truth a little more than she intended. "I'm not sure why you're here," she said softly, and for the first time in a long while she didn't feel a need to mask her frustration. "The suitors, they all think they know what I want. They think they know what I need. They parade around with their promises of power and wealth, and yet none of them see me. None of them see what I'm really looking for." Jonah turned his head, then his eyes meeting hers for the first time fully. There was no judgment in his gaze, no pity, just quiet understanding. "Well, then what are you looking for?" he asked, his voice gentle, but with an edge of curiosity. Lyra didn't know how to answer. For a long moment, she was silent, lost in thought. The answer wasn't something she had ever put into words before. "I'm looking for someone who can see beyond the expectations and the lies." She finally said, "Someone who isn't trying to impress me." or win me over with grand gestures. Someone who sees me as I am, not as some prize to be claimed. She spoke the words before she even realized what they meant. The weight of them hung in the air between them. Jonah stood still for a moment, taking in her words before he nodded slowly. "I think I understand," he said quietly. Then, after a beat, he added with a small smile, "But I can't say I'm much of a suitor, princess. That's not really my thing." Lyra raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You're not trying to impress me." He smirked slightly. "I'm trying to be honest with you, princess. Honesty's what matters more than anything else, isn't it?" Lyra stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His words felt so simple yet so foreign to her. No one had ever been this candid with her before. Most of her life had been spent surrounded by sycophants and diplomats, each trying to gain favor through carefully crafted words and gestures. Each suitor that had crossed her path had tried to impress her with their wealth or their intellect or their political power. But here was a human, a species she had always considered to be beneath her people, yet his words held a truth that felt deeper than anything she had ever heard before. It took her a moment to find her voice, and when she did, it was quieter than usual. "Honesty," she echoed, almost as if testing the word. She had never thought of it that way before. In the world she knew, people spoke in terms of power and control. They hid their true selves behind the masks of civility and charm. But here he was standing in front of her, offering nothing but his truth. How strange it felt to hear such honesty from someone who had nothing to gain from it. She glanced down at the city below, the vast alien landscape stretching out before her, as though contemplating the enormity of what she was feeling. This human was different from the others. But did that mean he was worthy of her attention? She wanted to laugh at herself for even thinking such things. What made him so special? She had no real reason to trust him. But then again, why should she trust anyone else? She finally looked back at him and spoke with a hint of challenge. "You think you can understand me better than the others? You think just because you speak plainly, you see who I really am?" Jonah gave a slight shrug, his gaze unwavering. "No, I don't think I understand you better than anyone else," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I think I just see you more clearly than they do." Lyra's brow furrowed. His words had a certain sharpness to them, an edge of something she couldn't quite place. Was it defiance? No, it wasn't that. It was something else, something far more genuine. But before she could analyze it further, Jonah spoke again. But his voice softened this time. "Look, I don't know what you want or need, but I know what I've seen in you so far. And it's not the princess they want you to be. It's not the princess they try to make you into so they can control you. It's the person who's buried underneath all that. And I respect that person a lot more than any crown or title could make me do." She was taken aback by his words, not because of their rawness, but because of their truth. He had just stripped away the very facade she had spent years building, the layers of expectation and duty that had shaped her into the woman everyone thought she should be. But what about the woman she truly was? She didn't know how to answer him. There were no words for what she was feeling, not yet at least. So instead, she found herself turning her gaze back to the horizon, unsure of what to say next. For the first time in her life, she felt the walls around her beginning to crumble. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face what lay behind them. But Jonah's presence felt strangely comforting in a way she hadn't expected. "You're different," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. But she meant it, and he heard it. He didn't smile or speak. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he had already known she had come to that conclusion. It was strange how such a simple interaction had already begun to change her view of the world she had always known. Maybe it was time to start questioning everything she had been taught. After all, for the first time she was starting to wonder if the answers could lie somewhere outside her kingdom. As the days passed after their conversation, Lyra found herself unable to shake the feeling that Jonah had left a mark on her, something that shifted the way she saw the world around her. She tried to push it aside, to focus on the duties she had been trained for, the endless events, the political games, the constant demands of her father. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, his words echoed in her mind. Honesty. It was a concept so simple yet so profound that it had begun to unravel the tightly wound threads of her life. It was as if a new door had opened, and now she couldn't ignore what lay behind it. She found herself searching for him more often than she cared to admit. His presence was like a breath of fresh air in a palace that always felt too suffocating, too controlled. When he wasn't there, It was as if the weight of her expectations bore down on her even harder. She needed something more, but she wasn't sure what it was. And then came the rumors in the halls of the palace. Whispers began to circulate among the nobles about the human delegate who had managed to capture the princess's attention. The murmurs were quiet at first, but soon they grew louder as more and more people began to notice that Lyra spent an unusual amount of time speaking to him. They were not subtle in their judgments. Some saw it as a disgrace, others as a weakness. They whispered that the princess had lost her way, that she was being influenced by the most unlikely of people. The king himself began to hear these rumors, and with each passing day, his frustration grew. At first, he dismissed them as nothing more than the idle gossip of those who were jealous of his daughter's independence. But as his advisors pushed him harder to make a decision, he found himself questioning his daughter's choices. The pressure began to mount, and it wasn't long before the king summoned her to his private chambers one evening. The air was thick with tension as she entered his study. The faint glow of 1,000 screens illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the floor. Lyra stood before her father, who sat at his desk, his face unreadable, his fingers tapping impatiently against the surface. "What is this I hear about you spending so much time with the human delegate?" he asked, his voice stern, though tinged with an edge of frustration. Lyra took a deep breath, her heart racing. She had expected this confrontation, but that didn't make it any easier. She had never been one to shy away from her father's gaze. But today it felt different. Today, she wasn't the dutiful princess who obeyed every command. She had become someone else, and that frightened her. "I don't see the harm in speaking to him, father," she replied, her voice steady but defiant. "He's not like the others. He doesn't play the same games the others do." "I don't care about his games, Lyra," the king interrupted, his tone growing sharper. "This is not about him. This is about the future of Zarian and your place within it. You have a duty to this kingdom, a duty to your people. The choice of your suitor is not a matter of personal preference. It is a matter of political necessity." Lyra felt her chest tighten at his words. She had heard them 1,000 times before, but today they felt like chains that threatened to bind her to a life she no longer wanted. "I know my duty, father, but I'm starting to wonder if that duty is what's best for Zarian," she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of her own thoughts. The king's eyes narrowed at her words. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "You will not question your duty, Lyra," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "You are the princess of Zarian, and you will do what is expected of you. This is not a matter of personal choice. It is a matter of the kingdom's future." She stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in on her. The pressure, the expectations, the years of being told who she should be, how she should act. It was all so much. She wanted to scream, but instead she clenched her fists and said nothing. The silence between them stretched on until the king broke it again. "Lyra, you have no idea the consequences of your actions," he said, his voice low and dangerous. But his words only hardened her resolve. She didn't know where her path would lead or what would happen next. But for the first time in her life, she felt certain of one thing: she could no longer follow the path her father had laid out for her. The days after her confrontation with her father felt like a blur, as if the weight of their conversation had left her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Lyra spent most of her time in the royal gardens, walking aimlessly among the flowers and the trees, trying to clear her mind. Yet the sound of her father's voice still echoed in her ears, his cold commands, his unwavering expectations. As if she were nothing more than a pawn in a game of politics, her every move predetermined by the needs of the kingdom. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't continue living like this. She couldn't keep pretending that her life was hers to control when it was really just a series of obligations she had been born into. And then there was Jonas. She couldn't forget the way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her with such raw honesty and no regard for the titles and the power that everyone else seemed to care about so much. He had seen her for who she truly was, not for the princess everyone expected her to be. And that made her question everything she had ever known about herself. She needed answers. She needed to understand why she was so drawn to him, why his words had burrowed so deeply into her heart, as if they were the only thing that had ever made sense. But she couldn't find the answers in the palace walls. They were too suffocating, too filled with whispers and eyes watching her every move. So she found herself seeking him out again and again, without even meaning to. She told herself it was just curiosity, that it was just an attempt to understand this strange human who had somehow shaken her very foundation. But deep down she knew there was more to it than that. One evening, as the sun began to set and the skies turned a deep shade of violet, Aeloria found herself walking through the halls of the palace toward the balcony where she had first met Jonah. She wasn't sure why she was going there or what she hoped to find, but there was something about the stillness of the moment that called to her. When she arrived, she found him standing just as he had been before, his back to her, gazing out at the city beneath them. She hesitated for a moment before speaking his name. It felt strange to say it again, to let it leave her lips, but it felt right to. Jonah turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a calmness that almost made her feel as though he had been waiting for her all along. He didn't speak at first, just watched her with that same quiet intensity she had come to expect from him. There was no judgment in his gaze, no expectations, no hurry for her to say anything, just a simple presence that seemed to take up all the space between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Princess, I didn't think you would come back." She felt a pang of something in her chest at his words, as if they held a hint of something she couldn't quite name. But instead of retreating from it, she stepped forward. "No, Jonah," she said quietly. "I don't think I can stay away anymore." She didn't know where her words were coming from or what they meant, but as soon as they left her mouth, she felt a strange sense of relief, as though the weight of the palace, the weight of her father's expectations, had been lifted off her shoulders. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her for a long moment before stepping aside to let her approach. There was no grand gesture, no declaration, just a simple act of trust that felt more meaningful than any words ever could. As she walked toward him, the city lights flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow on his face. For a moment she simply looked at him, seeing not the human delegate or the strange outsider who had captured her attention, but someone who had been more real to her than anyone else she had ever known. She took a deep breath and spoke again. "I need to understand, Jonah. I need to understand what you see in me, what you think I can be, because I don't know anymore. I've spent so long living up to what everyone expects of me that I've lost sight of who I really am, and I can't keep living like that." His expression softened, and for the first time there was a hint of something more in his eyes, a quiet understanding that made her feel as though he truly saw her for who she was. "I don't know if I can give you all the answers, Princess," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "but I know that you're more than what everyone else wants you to be, and maybe that's all you need to start with. Maybe you just need to believe in yourself first, and the rest will follow." Aeloria stood there for a long time, staring at Jonah, as if his words had unlocked something deep inside her, something she hadn't known was buried beneath the weight of her crown and her obligations. She had spent so many years trying to live up to others' expectations, trying to fulfill the role that had been forced upon her, that she had forgotten who she was beneath it, all forgotten that she had the right to choose her own path, the right to shape her own future. Jonah's words were like a lifeline in the dark, pulling her towards something that felt real and true, something she could no longer ignore. She wanted to ask him how he could be so sure of her when she had never been sure of herself. But instead, she simply took a step closer to him, something inside her urging her forward with a quiet urgency. There was a vulnerability in her now, a rawness that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The walls she had so carefully built around herself began to crumble with each breath she took, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to hide from it or from him. She looked up at him and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to move forward, Jonah," she said quietly, "but I know I can't go back to the way things were. I can't keep living this way." He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he just looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering, as if he was waiting for her to find her own answers. Aeloria took another step closer, until they were standing face to face. The space between them felt charged, as though the very air itself was waiting for something to shift. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, every instinct telling her that this moment was important, that it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet fully understand, but was too afraid to let slip away. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time she saw him not just as a human, not just as an outsider, But as someone who had seen her for who she was, and not for the crown she wore, you said I should believe in myself, she said, her voice trembling a little, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from him. What if I can't? What if I don't know how? Jonah stepped closer to, his presence steady and grounding. He reached out as if to gently touch her arm, but he hesitated for just a moment before speaking again. I can't give you all the answers, princess, he said, his voice soft but full of conviction. But I can tell you this, you're not alone. You don't have to figure this out by yourself. You have the strength in you to do whatever you decide. And maybe that's enough. Maybe all you need is to believe that you can choose for yourself. And then just take that first step. Lyra felt something shift within her at his words, as if a door she hadn't known was opening ever so slightly. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know where this would lead, or what her next step would be, but in that moment, she knew that she no longer had to carry the burden of others' expectations alone. Maybe Jonah was right. Maybe all she needed was to trust herself just a little bit more. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. But it wasn't a burden anymore. It felt like a release, like the beginning of something new, something she hadn't dared to imagine until now. She met Jonah's gaze once more and found a quiet understanding in his eyes waiting for her, without judgment, without pressure, just the invitation to move forward at her own pace. She smiled just a little, for the first time in ages, a smile that was hers alone, not the smile of a princess or a future queen, but the smile of a woman beginning to see herself for who she truly was. The days that followed were strange and uncertain for Lyra. Every step felt both freeing and terrifying at the same time. She was no longer able to ignore the weight of the expectations that still surrounded her, but now there was something different in the way she saw them. They no longer held the same power over her as they once had. Her conversations with Jonah continued, though they became more rare as the pressures of her royal duties began to creep back into her life. But she found herself looking forward to their moments together even more. She didn't fully understand what had shifted inside her, but she knew that something had changed, and it was something that couldn't be undone, no matter how much she tried to return to the life she had known before. Lyra still attended the grand feasts and the formal meetings that were expected of her. She still wore the crown and the mantle of responsibility, but it felt lighter somehow, as if a small piece of her had slipped free from the chains of duty and was beginning to breathe again. At the same time, her father grew more insistent with each passing day that she make a decision about her suitor. The whispers among the court had only grown louder as more and more rumors circulated about her growing interest in the human delegate. It was as if the walls of her life were closing in around her. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, her father's frustration had become palpable. Every time they spoke about the matter, his voice became more stern, and his patience. Then his advisors began to push harder, urging him to force her hand and settle the matter once and for all. She had to choose. But Lyra had grown more defiant with each attempt to manipulate her into the mold they had set for her, and though the pressure was mounting, she could no longer bring herself to care about the consequences if she chose differently. No one had ever given her the freedom to choose for herself. No one had ever trusted her judgment enough to let her decide what was best for her, so she made a choice. For the first time in her life, she decided to stop pretending to be the woman they wanted her to be. She would stop being the obedient princess who bent to the will of her father and the court. She would stop hiding behind the title and the responsibilities that had been thrust upon her. The next time she saw Jonah, she didn't know what she would say or what would come of it, but she knew that it would be different this time. It would be her choice and hers alone. She found him standing once again on the balcony, watching the city beneath them, the same stillness in his posture, the same quiet strength that had drawn her to him in the first place. She approached him slowly, feeling the tension in her chest as she came closer. But it was not fear that gripped her now. It was something else, something unfamiliar yet undeniable. Jonah. He turned at the sound of her voice, and his gaze softened. When he saw her standing there, he didn't speak right away, but simply waited, as if giving her the space to gather her thoughts and words. For a moment she couldn't find the right ones, but eventually she spoke softly. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, looking out over the city, her voice steady and sure, but filled with something deeper. "I don't know where this is going or what will happen, But I know one thing for certain, I'm not going to keep living the way I have been." She turned to face him, fully meeting his eyes with a quiet determination. "I can't keep living for them anymore. I have to live for me, and I need to find out what that means for myself." Jonah studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. But then he stepped closer, his presence grounding and calm. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, princess," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "You don't have to know exactly what comes next. But I think you've already made the most important choice, the hardest one. You've chosen to step away from the life that was planned for you, to take control of your own future, no matter how uncertain it may be, and that's what matters more than anything else in the end." Laura felt her heart swell at his words. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something new, something real, and she didn't know where it would take her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in years, she felt free. She smiled a little as she took another step closer to him. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly, but the fear didn't feel so overwhelming anymore. It felt like a kind of fear that came with something exciting and unknown, something she could face with someone who understood her, not as a princess or a future queen, but as a person, someone who would stand by her side, no matter what choice she made. "I know," he said simply, "I know." The days that followed were filled with a sense of quiet anticipation. Laura felt as though she were walking on a fine line between two worlds, one where she was the princess bound by duty and expectations, and another where she was just a woman seeking to discover who she truly was. But for the first time in her life, the weight of her crown felt lighter, and she realized that she didn't have to sacrifice her identity for the role she was born into. She could be both. She could still be the leader her people needed, and still find a way to live for herself too. Jonah remained by her side, though his presence was subtle and unassuming. He never pushed her to make a decision or take action before she was ready, but he was always there when she needed him, always ready to listen with an open heart and mind. In the palace, Laura continued to fulfill her duties, though now she did so with a renewed sense of purpose. She no longer pretended to be someone she wasn't. She no longer wore the mask of the perfect princess who could do no wrong. Instead, she embraced her imperfections and flaws, and in doing so, she found strength that she hadn't known she possessed. She made time for herself, something she had never done before. The long walks in the gardens, the quiet moments spent in her private chambers, reading or reflecting on her thoughts. She began to appreciate the quiet of her own company in a way that felt both freeing and grounding. At night, she would sometimes stand on the balcony, looking out at the stars and wondering what the future held for her. It was in those moments that she realized she didn't need to have all the answers or know exactly where her path would lead. All she needed to do was take the next step, one after another, trusting that her instincts would guide her. The whispers among the court never stopped, but they grew less frequent as Lyra began to assert herself more. With each passing day, she stood taller, she spoke with more confidence. And when the time came to address the matter of her suitors, the choice was hers alone. She had learned to trust her own voice, to speak up when necessary, and to challenge the things that no longer served her. And when her father finally called her into his chambers to discuss a future, she didn't hesitate to tell him what she had decided. She would no longer be forced into a marriage for political gain. She would choose a suitor based on what felt right for her. And if that meant defying the expectations of the court, then so be it. She was ready to take control of her life, to step into a future that was her own. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her father's approval, but not because she was doing what he wanted, but because he saw her as the person she had become, someone capable of making her own choices, her own decisions, someone who could lead with both strength and compassion. In the end, Lyra didn't choose Jonah as a suitor she didn't need, till she had already chosen him. In a way, when she chose herself, when she stopped living for others and began living for her own truth, Jonah remained a part of her life, not as a lover or a prince, but as a companion, a friend, someone who had helped her see her own worth and the endless possibilities that lay before her. Their bond was one of respect and understanding. And that was enough. Lyra knew that her journey was far from over, that there would still be obstacles to face, challenges to overcome. But for the first time, she felt ready. She had shattered the expectations placed upon her, and in doing so, she had found herself the woman who would lead her people, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And that was the greatest power she could ever possess.